I think that sounds better. All right, so this is my second take. So I'm learning. I had to switch rooms for this podcast. My family's home for this one, so had to switch because it's a little bit embarrassing to record with your family home. So for this episode of this podcast, I wanted to take a second to correct a couple errors I had in my first podcast. That I named episode 00 because I was kind of just messing around and I just wanted to talk and work on the camera, the mic, and editing. So I didn't want to have a really structured first episode and then end up having to change the structure after that episode. So I named it episode 00. This might be episode 00 part B, or this might be officially episode 1. We'll see after I've edited it what I decide, because I really want to have a consistent structure for all episodes. And I really want to ensure that I maintain that structure and I maintain the standard of excellence that this podcast will be known as. It's weird talking to a mic because you're less likely to use filler words. So, the first thing I wanted to address on this episode, whether this is episode 1 or episode 0 part B, whatever it is, I wanted to address a couple errors from my first podcast. So from last week's episode, since it was so off the cuff, I didn't plan on speaking about anything in specific, I didn't plan on speaking about anything specifically. I just talked, and sure enough, I had a couple errors once I reread it. This episode is sponsored by LaCroix. They don't know it yet, but they sponsored it. So, in this episode, I want to discuss the errors from the previous podcast. And in that podcast, I went on a rant about modulators. So I wanted to correct those errors. In that podcast, I'm not certain what the errors were that I said, but I wanted to clarify that Kaleido is actually VX770, and its generic name is ivacaftor. Orkambi or Combi, some people pronounce it Orkambi. Orkambi is combo therapy and the combination drugs are VX770 and VX809. Those brand names or generic names or whatever are ivacaftor and lumacaftor. Lumacaftor is 809, 770 is ivacaftor. And what was I going to say about that? Oh, in that podcast, I called Kaleido, I'm not sure what I called it, but Kaleido I was correct, I was accurate. Kaleido is a potentiator. So Kaleido, VX770, is used for people the CFTR protein reaches the surface, but the CFTR protein doesn't allow for chloride ions to travel through the channel. So that's why it's called a potentiator, because it allows for the gates to open. Orkambi, since it affects mutations that are more severe, the mutations require both a corrector and a potentiator. And so ivacaftor, like I said, is a potentiator, whereas lumacaftor is a corrector. And the new results that were released, I believe, in February and March, were for basically what I will call Orkambi 2.0. The results were not incredible, but they were good, and the results were for combo therapy of the drugs tezacaftor and ivacaftor. So lumacaftor, which is 809, is no longer going to be in that cocktail. Orkambi 2.0 is 661, which is tezacaftor, which is the corrector, with the potentiator 770, which is Kaleido, which is also ivacaftor. So I know that's confusing. I just wanted to correct those errors. But those results really just showed safer. They showed less of the adverse effects that Orkambi shows. And then I'll get into the triple combo therapy. I don't want to talk too much about that right now. I want to do a full podcast on. I want to do a full episode on modulators where I discuss that in a more in-depth manner. but I will only discuss that once I've discussed CF itself in a more in-depth manner from the biochemical perspective. So on this episode of podcast, I really wanted to discuss the goals of what this podcast series or podcast will be. And then I want to do on this episode discuss what CF is to the general population, because I know people have a pretty decent understanding of it, but most people call it a lung disease, and I want to clarify why that isn't exactly the best way to look at CF. And then I want to discuss the CRISPR-Cas results, or the CRISPR-Cas experiment that scientists did this week, because I want to discuss how that plays into the bigger picture with CF medicine. So the goals of this podcast. For this podcast, I want to talk about life with CF from the perspective of a person that has suffered with CF. And I want to discuss the regimens I do. I want to discuss how I've maintained such exceptional health. And it's not, spoiler alert, it's not anything I do in particular other than being compliant. I've been very fortunate, but I want to discuss the importance of a lot of the stuff I do. That's not going to be all on this episode. It's going to be what I do with this podcast. So I don't want to have 30 to 40 minute episodes every time necessarily, because most topics won't entail such long-winded explanations. So I want to split things up a lot more. And so really, not only do I want to describe life with CF from the perspective of a person that suffers from it, but I want to discuss life with CF from a scientific perspective as well. I think that a scientific understanding of life with CF is crucial. It's pertinent to the future of CF medicine, but it's also pertinent to people who struggle with it. Understanding CF from a scientific perspective, is it gives you a stronger hold on the disease. It allows you to have a better, if you have a better understanding of the disease, it makes it easier to fight the disease. So I want to discuss the scientific perspective as well. I think it's important that people who struggle with it, but also the people that come into contact with our lives, I think it's important that they understand life with CF, but I also think it's important for them to understand more than that. I think it makes it better for everybody involved if friends and family of people with CF understand what CF actually is, what causes CF, how people inherit CF. I don't think that more knowledge is never bad when dealing with CF. So I think that part of my goal with this podcast is to reduce people's current understanding of CF, because there's a lot of misleading, maybe not misleading. I want to reduce people's knowledge of CF to my situation so that people can see what I deal with, because I'm not necessarily a classical case of CF. I'm not everybody's example of somebody with CF, but I have the most common mutation, and I present with most of the most common, or all of the most common side effects of CF, or adverse effects of CF. Though I've been healthy, I haven't had as much experience being in the hospital and stuff like that. But like I said, I think that I can explain things that I deal with in a good way. So I want to reduce people's understanding of CF to not just what they see. I want to be open about a lot of the other perspectives about CF, because when you're 23 years old with CF, you've dealt with it your entire life. So unless you take the time to think about what you do on a daily basis, it feels normal. So sometimes it's important as a CF patient to separate yourself from your disease for a minute and separate yourself from your daily life with CF, and then consider how abnormal it really is to take medication every time you eat, or how abnormal it is to always be on antibiotics. or how abnormal it is to have to do chest physiotherapy twice a day. All of that stuff is really abnormal when you separate yourself from what you've known for your entire life. And so sometimes it's good to separate yourself and look at that and reconsider that. It makes you appreciate certain aspects of your quality of life, and it makes you, I think it kind of regenerates motivation for fighting CF. Because when you consider CF a job for so long, it, just like any job, it wears down on you. And so when you take a step back and remember there's a fly not on the lens, but on the, when you take a step back and think about, what you have to do with CF, it allows for you to remember why it's important that you do that stuff. If we don't remember why we have to be compliant with our medication or our chest physiotherapy, it normalizes it to the point where you don't feel as motivated to do it, and then you forget almost why you do it if you don't, take the time to remember that. So I want to do that. I want to, and I think a lot of people who know me forget that I have CF or forget the potential dangers with CF. So if I don't, try to remind people of what we go through on a daily basis, I think it can almost inadvertently make people believe that CF isn't as life affecting as it is. So I want to, reduce people's understanding to help people remember day-to-day life with CF. And then other than that, I want to do, like I said, I want to focus on the scientific aspects of CF. So not only do I want to help people remember the day-to-day life with CF, but I want people to have a better surface knowledge of CF, because most people who know somebody with CF know that it's a chronic disease, but they don't understand why enzymes are important, or why maintenance antibiotics are important, or why most people don't know what a tune-up is, or why certain things with CF are the way they are. So I want to help people. People think that Orkambi is a medication, and I'm sure some people think Orkambi is an antibiotic. So explaining to people what a modulator is allows for people to have, a better, more intimate relationship with the disease. And so especially people with CF, if you understand that, it makes the fight easier. But also people who are friends and family with us, or friends and family of us, it improves their understanding of that. And on a further point, it allows for them to see what the amazing fundraising efforts of the CF Foundation have generated. It allows you to understand that Vertex worked with the CF Foundation, and the CF Foundation used the money that was raised at the CF walks over the last couple decades they spent that money to develop a lot of these drugs I'm on. So it is important that people understand the scientific aspects of things, because then they can see what their fundraising dollars have contributed to. So I want to take the time to explain to people what CF is from a biochemistry perspective, or from a biochemical perspective, and then I want to discuss how drugs work, and there's a lot of grander purposes to why I want to do this. I want to explain, when I talk about antibiotics with CF, I want to talk about antibiotics and what the importance of antibiotics, and I'll talk about the importance of understanding why it's. I want to talk about why it's so important to understand vaccinations and why people need to vaccinate, and it's not just something that affects them, but it affects the people around them. So with this podcast, I want to take the time to discuss stuff like that, so that people can have a more improved, nuanced understanding and perspective on things that affect the life of somebody with CF. But I also believe that, like I said, knowledge is good, and I believe people genuinely want to learn more about CF. And I think people feel guilty asking a lot of the time, since, talking about CF can be heavy sometimes, and sometimes being somebody who suffers from it, sometimes I think that people don't want to ask about it because they feel as though they're, I think that sometimes it makes people feel like they're maybe encroaching on territory they don't believe they should encroach. So I want to offer, this is my medium to talk and get my thoughts out there. So that's over the last week, that's really what I've thought about with this podcast, is that, I have a lot of ideas, and I love talking about CF. Like I said in my last podcast, CF is a full-time career for me. So why would I not want to talk about it more? So yeah, those are really the main goals of my podcast, to help educate, help spread awareness, help talk about some things that maybe a lot of people don't feel comfortable asking about, or even as a CFer, some people don't feel comfortable talking about. And I know the term CFer has sometimes carries a negative connotation. Sometimes people don't like using that word to describe themselves with CF because, it does define you as a person, as somebody who is characterized by CF, as opposed to somebody who just, that's part of their life. And I'll talk about that in one episode. I'll talk about my perspective on the term CFer, and I'll talk about, I'd like to talk about how to talk about some of these things with people with CF. Asking people, for example, I love talking about the mortality aspect, because I believe that living with CF has influenced my perspective of the future. It's very much influenced my perspective of the future. So I don't like to do things. For example, if I were to consider going back to school, or for why I decided against med school, being healthy for 4 more years would be great, and I think I will be healthy for 4 more years. But med school is incredibly stressful, and a life as a resident afterwards is sometimes 80, 90, 100-hour work weeks. And with CF, I felt as though that could shorten my time. So I decided against med school because I felt like it was the best for my future. But having a sense of mortality allowed me to make what I believe was a mature adult decision, and what was best for me now and best for my future. So it also, med school was, for me, what I believed was a way for me to use my CF to help a lot of people. But here I am, a year and a couple months after deciding, a year and a half after deciding against med school, and I've started a podcast. So who knows, maybe this can be my outlet for improving people's life with CF and people's understanding of CF. That's part of my goals with this. So that's really one of my motivations for starting this podcast. So for the first episode, I'm not going to talk too much longer, but for this episode, I wanted to briefly describe what CF is to just a layperson's understanding. CF is a genetic disease caused by a recessive mutation. There are lots of different mutations, but it basically causes the CFTR protein, which is the cystic fibrosis the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator protein. It's a protein that one of its main functions is chloride ion. It's a chloride ion channel. So I don't want to get into the biochemistry of this yet. That's a separate podcast. But what that causes is, since the chloride ion channel is broken, it causes excessively thick mucus. So anywhere on the body that has a mucous membrane doesn't function properly. So there's a mucous membrane in the lungs, in the sinuses, in the pancreas, and the gastrointestinal tract. So all of these areas have excessive mucus that can block ducts. It makes it harder to combat infection. So combating infection is more difficult. So a lot of times people consider cystic fibrosis to be a lung disease. That's not really the most proper way to explain it, because some people have very healthy lungs, and one of their biggest difficulties with CF is their pancreas. For me and Alyssa, we've always been pancreatic insufficient. We've also had, for me, one of my most problematic issues with CF has been my sinuses. I've had, I think, 7 sinus surgeries, and it makes it difficult for me to, sometimes I start to lose my sense of smell because I have such such blockage in my sinuses, so it's hard to clear sinus infections. So it can cause strep throat more easily and stuff like that. And then with CF, since it causes the lungs to have an excessively thick mucus, it makes it harder to clear infection, and it makes it easier for bacteria to colonize, which means that they basically live in the lungs all the time, which then makes it easier for them to it makes it easier for there to be an exacerbation or a flare-up, which is when the mucus basically grows, it destabilizes the balance in the lungs, which causes there to be pneumonia. And the constant colonization of bacteria and the continuous recurring lung infections that occur with CF causes there to be what's called bronchiectasis. And so over the long term, there's inflammation because of these bacteria, which are not, the bacteria are not supposed to be there, obviously. So the body is trying to fight them off, which then causes constant inflammation. And over the long, over years and years and years of these infections and this constant inflammation, there's scar tissue buildup from the deeper part of the air lobes. So the lungs start to hold less and less volume, and as they hold less and less volume, obviously it makes it more difficult to breathe for someone with CF. So this is really why CF is considered a lung disease, because over the long term, lung infections are what make living with CF so difficult. But on a day-to-day basis, if your PFTs are at a relatively okay baseline, that isn't actually, sometimes for a lot of people, for me personally, it's not what affects my day-to-day basis it doesn't affect it as much as, for example, my pancreatic insufficiency. So having pancreatic insufficiency means I have to take enzymes every time I eat, and if I don't, it can basically I won't digest the food that I'm eating, so it can lead to weight loss, it can lead to malnourishment, it can cause lots of problematic stomach issues. So this is where GI issues come into play. And then there's also cystic fibrosis related diabetes. Since the pancreas is not functional and it doesn't produce the enzymes needed to break down certain foods, and since over the long term this can lead to lack of insulin and glucagon production, so then there's cystic fibrosis related diabetes, which can be problematic in the long term, obviously. So all of these issues become cystic fibrosis is a multi-organ disease, so all of the issues over the long term require antibiotics, require maintenance meds, require all kinds of different perspectives of treatment. So whenever I go to my appointments, I see a pulmonologist, I see a nutritionist, I see a social worker, and that all the physical manifestations of CF, that doesn't even take into account the fact that our medications are incredibly expensive. So we have to always worry about healthcare and how we're going to obtain our meds. And then on top of that, living with CF it's a difficult job. So there's a mental, psychological part of CF too that can really, really, really make life difficult. So I wanted to take the time to let people know what cystic fibrosis is. I will explain inheritance. So like I said, it's a genetic disease that's caused by a recessive mutation. So both parents of a patient with CF are carriers of the mutation. Sometimes the parent can obviously have CF, and then that's a whole different thing. There's also reproductive issues with people with CF. But so both parents have to be a carrier. And if both parents are carrier, there's a 1 in 4 chance the child would have CF. I would like to take the time on a future podcast to describe inheritance and all of that, because it's Mendelian genetics is what it's called, and it can be, for CF, it's actually really, really simple. Cystic fibrosis is typically discussed in most introductory biology classes as a very, very simple explanation of what's called, like I said, Mendelian genetics, which is inheritance from a recessive gene versus a dominant gene and stuff like that. But I've said stuff like that a bunch. But so one thing that's really interesting with CF is that if the parent is a carrier, that means that they have broken CFTR in half of their cells, or that they don't produce functional, one of their chromosomes where the CFTR gene is located, that gene does not produce functional cells with fully functional CFTR. So interestingly enough, it seems to be that you only need about 50% of CFTR function to have a normal cell. So that's really interesting, and that's, like I said, I'll get into modulators and CFTR and CFTR function in the future, but it's really interesting because scientists and doctors don't really know how much CFTR you need exactly, CFTR function. So if we know that you need at most 50%, but it could be as low as 30%. So when looking for better modulators, we really don't know what the target should be. And obviously every patient's different. So my CFTR probably works a little bit better than some others since I've maintained such a healthy bill of health for so long, and I've only had very few exacerbations that required hospitalizations. And as we're learning more and more about CF, we learn that there's lots of genes that upregulate and downregulate CFTR, which just means increase and decrease CFTR function. So it's all really complicated, but in this podcast episodes, I'd like to talk about this stuff and explain it and help people understand it. So CF is really it's just, it is something that affects every minute of every day, unfortunately. And part of having CF is that you try to juggle wanting to educate and help people with realizing that when you're educating others, you are explaining what your life is, and that they'll never fully understand that. So there's a little bit of the complex of balancing explaining CF to people with realizing that it's our life. So when we explain it to people, we're not just telling you a cool story that happens to us once a day. Usually this is stuff we deal with on a daily basis. I've done hundreds. If I have to do a chest physiotherapy vest treatment morning and night, some days 3 times a day, I've been doing that for 2.5 decades. So I've done it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So this isn't something, when I explain it to people, this isn't something that just is, a small part of our life. It's something that we can't even envision a life without it because it's so ingratiated in our brains. So it's a difficult disease, and here I am on this podcast. I want this to be kind of a personal journal, personal diary where I can explain that and allow people to understand that. And people don't have to know me, but people who do know me know I'm pretty vocal about this. So that's why I'm here starting this. So this all comes back to why I'm doing this. It's part of my goals of this podcast. And so the final thing I want to talk about this podcast on this episode, and I'm probably going to do this on future episodes as well, whenever there's new results or anything, new data, new experiment or whatever that could be beneficial to the CF community or is of importance to the CF community, I'd like to discuss it. So this week, scientists successfully edited an embryo to fix a mutation that causes disease using a strategy called CRISPR-Cas. CRISPR is technically what the segments of DNA are called, and Cas, I believe, is the molecule that actually does the job of editing the DNA. And don't hold me to this. I'm not an expert on CRISPR-Cas, obviously, but CRISPR-Cas has been, it's been talked about for quite some time now. It's been discussed for quite some time in the CF community and the CF scientific community. It's been, there's been a lot of hope for what CRISPR-Cas can do. So obviously these results this week that scientists successfully edited an embryo were massive. They showed that they could in the future potentially cure disease using this strategy. CF would be one of those diseases. Hopefully, ideally, you could, because you could just fix the mutation if you know the mutation of the baby or the embryo, whatever. This is big, but I want to offer cautious optimism. I want to talk about it's huge news, but it's a far way off. I'm not going to prognosticate about how long this could be off. It's really, really important that we realize that DNA editing it carries massive bioethical implications. This is something that needs to be heavily regulated. This is something that needs to be discussed. We need to discuss potential issues. You could potentially designer babies are a big bioethical issue with CRISPR-Cas, because you could technically create babies that fit your standard of beauty, or you could increase the likelihood that the baby was going to be tall or have a more defined musculature or whatever it is. And it carries big bioethical implications because people could abuse the power of CRISPR-Cas. And since it's DNA editing, and there's other ethical concerns, we don't know what CRISPR-Cas would mean for an embryo that developed into a fetus, which ended up being a live baby, which became a human. We don't know the long-term effects of CRISPR-Cas because it's a strategy that we've never. This is the first time American scientists have successfully edited an embryo. So cautious optimism is necessary in this case, because we need to make sure that we don't, as a CF community and really scientific community and really just as citizens of the world, we need to cling on to the science that is doing great things for CF right now. We need to improve better. We need improved antibiotics. We need improved anti-inflammatories. And probably most importantly, we need improved modulators. So clinging on to the hope that CRISPR-Cas could potentially be the cure to CF is, in my opinion, not the best way to look at these results, because, like I said, it has massive bioethical implications, and we don't know how far off this is until we don't know how far off until it will be implemented in humans to cure disease and actually implant those edited embryos. So cautious optimism is how I think we should look at these results, because there are great drugs right now that are coming out for CF. The triple combo therapy that Vertex released could effectively improve and increase CFTR function to maybe, I'm not going to say any specific number, but it could increase CFTR function greatly. Like I said, some of the patients in that study showed normal chloride levels, which is one of the biggest measurements of CF manifestation. Really high abnormal chloride levels typically means that the patient has little to no CFTR function. So showing normal chloride levels, showing normal chloride levels indicates that CFTR is working well enough to get the chloride out of the cell, which is exactly what CFTR is supposed to do. So the CRISPR results are great, but we need to take a step back and realize that this is something that we have to be measured about. We have to have measured expectations, and we need to still feel, or we still need to focus on the importance of all the other drugs that are being developed by the CF Foundation and what those drugs could potentially mean for the community. So, like I said, great results. I'm thrilled to see that we've successfully done this. As a person with CF, I've always been really fascinated with CRISPR-Cas. I think that it could be massive, and I think that it could effectively be what eliminates CF from the population in the future at some point. But the other concerns of CRISPR-Cas is it might not be able to be used as of now. Scientists really don't know how it could be implemented in humans that are already alive as opposed to embryos. So with better modulators, we could eventually see that people with CF, people my age, people in their teens, young kids, or even older people in their 30s and 40s who have pretty stable, healthy baseline lung function, other improved modulators and improved drugs are the best case scenario for people in those scenarios. So we need to be happy with these results, but still fight the good fight of finding better drugs for CF that are currently being developed in the pipeline. And as a scientist myself, I actually wanted to finish this podcast up. So I, unfortunately, my battery died, so I had to go charge it for a couple hours, and now I'm back. But as I mentioned, I think the CRISPR results, I think the CRISPR the scientists successfully editing the embryo was really, really good news. I think it's great. I think it's going to be a scientific. It was an important scientific breakthrough that needed to happen for genetic engineering. And I think in the future, gene therapy is going to be a really useful technique for genetic diseases, cancers, really anything that has a genetic influence or component to it. But I wanted to finish this podcast by thanking you guys again for listening. I really, really like this. I think that this could be a really good platform for me to use to share good, positive experiences with CF, but also share some of the harder stuff that a lot of times we don't like to talk about. Really, if you could please, if you listen to this on the iTunes or the podcast app, please review it, comment, give me feedback. If you review and subscribe, it's awesome. It can help me out. It can help me reach a bigger audience. I hope that I can really reach a big audience with this. So thank you so much for listening.